She was only 7 years old, barefoot and bleeding, but Nora Hayes carried more courage than most grown men in Comanche County, with nothing but a notebook, a hidden truth, and her father's final hope. She came to the one man who had forgotten how to care. But the moment Eli Calloway opened his door, he stepped into a war against greed, corruption, and fear. Will one child's voice be enough to wake a sleeping town? If you believe in stories like this, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to help this frontier spirit reach more hearts.
Dawn in Comanche County didn't break. It just sort of bled into the sky. It was October 1878. The air had teeth. 5 in the morning, and Eli Calloway stood out by the stables. The light was a bruised gray. He held a tin cup of coffee he'd forgotten to drink. It was stone cold. Inside the stall, Sergeant snorted. The old horse shifted his weight. He looked at Eli. It was a long, heavy look. Sometimes Eli wondered if the animal pitied him. Eli didn't mind. Pity was quiet. Quiet was all he wanted. Up at the house, the back door creaked open. Maggie Flynn stepped out onto the porch. She wiped her hands on her apron. "Breakfast is hot, Eli," she called out. He didn't answer. He didn't move. Maggie stood there for a second, then she shook her head, turned around, and went back inside. She'd leave a plate on the stove. She always did. This was the routine, a quiet understanding between a man trying to disappear and a woman who refused to let him starve while he did it. By 9 o'clock, the sun was high enough to bake the dew off the grass. Eli was out by the north pasture. He was mending a fence that didn't really need mending. He just needed the swing of the hammer, the rhythm, the sweat, anything to keep the ghosts out of his head. Deputy was asleep in the shade of a mesquite bush. Suddenly, the dog's ears twitched. He stood up. He trotted toward a dry creek bed about 50 yards out. Then he barked. It wasn't a hunting bark. It wasn't angry. It was a sharp, confused sound. Eli paused. He let the hammer drop to the dirt. He wiped his brow with the back of his sleeve and walked over. The brush rustled. Eli stopped. He put a hand near his holster. Old instincts. They never really died. The brush parted. It wasn't a coyote. It wasn't a drifter. It was a girl. She couldn't have been more than 7 years old. Her dress was torn at the hem. Her hair was a tangled mess of dirt and briars. She was barefoot. But it was her face that stopped Eli's heart from beating for a solid second. She didn't look scared. She looked like she had pushed right past fear, waded through it, and come out the other side entirely hollowed out. It was the face of absolute exhaustion. She looked up at him. She looked at his shirt. At the faded silver star he still kept pinned there, a habit he couldn't break. Then she looked him dead in the eye. "My father's notebook said you know the right thing to do," she said. Her voice was cracked, dry as dust. "I walked 11 miles. Are you Mr. Calloway?" Eli didn't say anything. He couldn't. He looked down at her feet. They were cut to ribbons, bleeding, raw, 11 miles on Texas dirt and rock. Eli dropped to one knee. He didn't think about it. His legs just gave out. He stared at those small, broken feet. Then he looked at the little leather book she was clutching to her chest like a shield. "What's your name?" he asked. His voice was rough. "Nora Hayes. My father was Daniel Hayes." Eli closed his eyes. The breath hitched in his throat. Daniel Hayes. The dirt at Pea Ridge. The smoke. The hands that had dragged him out of the line of fire 16 years ago. "Daniel Hayes," Eli repeated. Not a question. An anchor. "You knew my father?" "Once, a long time ago." "My father is dead," Nora said. Her tone was flat. Too flat for a child. "I don't want to cry in front of you. You're still a stranger, but can you give me something to eat? I've been walking since yesterday." Eli swallowed hard. The absolute control she had. The way she put her survival over her grief. It broke something loose inside him. Something he had kept locked up tight for 4 years. He reached out. "Why did you come out here all alone, Nora?" he asked softly. "That's a dangerous walk. Why didn't you stay with your kin?" Nora tightened her grip on the notebook. She stood a little straighter. "Uncle Vernon says I'm just a child and have no right to speak," Nora said clearly, every word ringing out in the quiet morning air. "But my father taught me different. He said, every child born has a right to be safe and heard, no matter how small or poor they are. I came looking for my right, Mr. Calloway." Eli stared at her. The sheer weight of those words. They weren't just the words of a dead man. They were a demand for basic human dignity, standing right here in the Texas dirt. He didn't ask another question. Eli reached down, scooped her up into his arms, and stood. She felt as light as a bundle of dry kindling. Deputy fell into step beside them, wagging his tail. Maggie didn't ask questions either. She saw Eli come through the back door with a bleeding child in his arms, and she just moved. Within minutes, there was a basin of hot water on the floor, bandages on the table, a bowl of leftover beef stew steaming in front of the girl. Nora ate like she was starving, because she was. She didn't bother trying to be polite. Eli stood by the window, his back to the room. He held Daniel's leather notebook in his hands. He opened it. He read the neat, familiar handwriting. With every page he turned, the air in the room felt heavier. Maggie finished binding Nora's feet. She wiped the dirt from the girl's face with a damp cloth. Nora set her spoon down. The bowl was empty. She looked at Eli's broad back. "Mr. Calloway?" Eli turned around. He kept a safe distance. He didn't want to crowd her. "Will you send me back?" she asked. It was the most dangerous question anyone had asked him in 4 years. If he said yes, he could go back to his quiet, empty life. If he said no, he had to start living again. He had to care. And caring was the one thing he swore he'd never do again. He looked at her bandaged feet. He thought about the words she had spoken out there in the pasture. A right to be safe. Eli took a slow breath. "Not today," he said. Nora studied his face. She weighed the answer. Then she gave a small single nod. "Okay," she said softly. "Today is fine." The night settled heavy over the ranch. Texas nights usually brought a breeze, a chance to breathe. Not tonight. The air was still. It felt like the world was holding its breath. Maggie had set up a small pallet in the spare storeroom. A thick quilt, a feather pillow. A single tallow candle casting long, jumping shadows against the pine boards. Nora sat on the edge of the blanket. She didn't complain. To a child who had spent the last week sleeping on a cold dirt floor at Vernon Pratt's place, this was a palace. Maggie stood in the doorway. She wiped her hands on her apron. "You need anything else, little bird?" Maggie asked. Nora shook her head, but she didn't lie down. She looked past Maggie down the dark hallway. "Ma'am?" "Yes, honey." "Mr. Calloway, how long has he been sad?" Maggie stopped wiping her hands. She leaned against the doorframe. The wood creaked. "A long time," Maggie said softly. "It shows," Nora said. Her voice was too steady, too old. "People who stay sad a long time. They look out windows even when there's nothing out there to see." Maggie looked at the child. She felt a lump form in her throat. She didn't say anything. She just nodded, blew out the candle, and pulled the door shut. Morning came with the smell of strong chicory coffee and frying bacon. Nora woke early. It was a habit born of necessity. You didn't sleep in when you lived with Daniel Hayes. There were chores, chickens to feed, water to draw. She slipped out of the storeroom. Her bandaged feet padded softly against the floorboards. The house was quiet. Eli was already out by the stables. Maggie was out back at the pump. Nora walked down the hall. At the very end of the corridor, there was a door. It wasn't latched. The wind must have rattled it loose in the night. It stood open, just a crack. Nora stopped. She didn't mean to snoop, but children are drawn to closed spaces. She pushed the door open an inch more. The room was pristine. It didn't smell like dust. It smelled like dried lavender and old wax. There was a pale blue bonnet resting on a wooden stand. Next to it, a pair of tiny leather shoes. They were so small, the heels weren't even worn down. Pinned to the wall above the washstand was a piece of paper. The handwriting was elegant, rushed. Nora could read. She sounded out the words in her head. "Eli, eat breakfast before you head out. I mean it." See. She stood perfectly still. She didn't touch anything. She just looked. A shadow fell across the doorway. Nora turned. Eli stood there. His face was a mask of stone. The lines around his mouth were tight. His eyes were dark, unreadable. For a split second, Nora saw something break behind his eyes, a sudden violent fracture. Then the stone slid back into place. He didn't yell. That made it worse. He walked past her. He grabbed the heavy brass knob. "I'm sorry," Nora said. She stepped back into the hall. "I didn't know it was a room you couldn't go in." "You know now," Eli said. His voice was gravel, cold and rough. He pulled the door shut. The lock clicked, a sharp final sound. He walked down the hall, grabbing his hat from the peg by the front door. He didn't look back. Nora watched him go. She didn't cry. She understood. You protect the things you can't bear to lose, even if they're already gone. Eli made it as far as the kitchen door. Maggie was standing there. Her arms were crossed. She held a wooden spoon like a weapon. "Where are you going?" Maggie asked. "Fences," Eli muttered. He didn't look at her. "You fixed the north line yesterday. The south line is fine. Then I'll break them and fix them again." Maggie didn't move. She stepped squarely into his path. She was a foot shorter than him, but right now she filled the whole doorway. "I saw what happened," Maggie said. "I saw her looking in that room. And I saw you shut down. It's none of her business. It's none of yours." "Eli Calloway." Her voice was a whip crack. "Stop it. Stop feeling sorry for yourself." Eli's jaw clenched. "Maggie, let me pass." "No. You think you're the only one who lost something? That little girl out there just lost her whole world. And you're shutting her out because you're terrified. You're terrified of caring about something that breathes." Eli looked away, out toward the dusty plains. "I can't." "You have to," Maggie said. Her voice dropped. It wasn't angry anymore. It was fiercely, desperately earnest. She reached out and grabbed his forearm. Her grip was tight. "Listen to me, Eli. Do you think only men with badges have the right to hurt? Pain doesn't care if you're rich or poor, grown or little." She shook his arm, forcing him to meet her eyes. "The right to live happily is God-given to all living things. You have no right to strip that away from yourself or from that little girl." The words hung in the air, heavy, true. Eli stared at Maggie. The tension slowly bled out of his shoulders. The fight left him. He took a ragged breath. He looked down at his boots. "She needs shoes," Eli said quietly. "Her feet are torn up." Maggie smiled, a sad, knowing smile. She let go of his arm. "Then take her to town. Buy her some boots." The ride to Harlan Creek took an hour. Eli saddled Sargent. He lifted Nora up, settling her carefully in front of the saddle horn. He swung up behind her. They rode in silence. The prairie stretched out around them, a sea of yellow grass under a bleached blue sky. 15 minutes in, Nora spoke. She didn't turn her head. She just looked straight out over the horse's ears. "Are you a good man, Mr. Calloway?" Eli shifted his grip on the reins. He looked at the back of her small head. "I don't know anymore," he said. It was the truest thing he had said in years. "That's a good man's answer," Nora said simply. "Bad men always say yes real quick." Eli felt a strange tightness in his chest. "Where did you learn that?" "My father told me. He was right about most things." They reached Harlan Creek just before noon. The town was a dusty strip of false front buildings, a saloon, a bank, and a general store. Eli tied Sargent to the hitching post outside the mercantile. He lifted Nora down. She winced when her bandaged feet hit the boardwalk, but she didn't complain. Inside, the store smelled of peppermint, coffee beans, and cured leather. "Boots," Eli told the clerk. "Smallest you got, sturdy ones." Nora sat on a wooden crate. She tried on 3 different pairs. She was deadly serious about it. She tested the leather. She walked a few steps. She didn't rush. This was important. "These," she finally said, pointing to a pair of tough brown leather lace-ups. Eli paid. He bought her a stick of peppermint candy, too. He didn't know why. He just felt like he should. They stepped out onto the boardwalk. The sun was blinding. Across the street, standing in the shade of the bank's awning, was a man. He wore a tailored brown suit, a bowler hat. He held a silver-tipped cane. It was Arthur Vane, Hiram Gould's lawyer. Vane wasn't moving. He wasn't walking anywhere. He was just standing there, watching them. Eli stopped. He felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The instincts he had buried for 4 years screamed to life. That wasn't a casual look. That was a man sizing up a target. A man doing the math. Eli didn't draw his gun. He didn't shout. He just took a half-step forward. He put himself directly between Nora and Arthur Vane's line of sight. He stared across the dusty street. "I see you," Eli's eyes said. "I see exactly what you are." Vane smiled. It was a thin, bloodless thing. He tipped his bowler hat, turned, and walked into the bank. Eli looked down at Nora. She was holding her peppermint stick. She hadn't noticed the man. "Let's go home," Eli said. On the ride back, the heat of the afternoon settled in. The steady rocking of the horse was like a lullaby. About halfway back to the ranch, Eli felt a small weight press against his chest. He looked down. Nora had fallen asleep. Her head was tucked perfectly against his breastbone. Her small hands were loosely holding the saddle horn. Eli froze. He barely dared to breathe. He felt the steady, light thumping of her heartbeat against his own. He wrapped his left arm around her, just to steady her, just to make sure she didn't fall. He looked out at the horizon. His jaw was set. His eyes were clear. For the first time in 4 years, his hands weren't trembling. The dust cloud appeared on the horizon around 10 the next morning. Eli was chopping firewood. He stopped mid-swing. He rested the axe head on the chopping block and watched the trail. A black buggy was rolling toward the ranch gates. 2 men were inside. Eli wiped his hands on a rag. He walked to the front porch. Maggie stepped out of the house. She stood right beside him. Inside, safely behind the screen door, Nora watched. The buggy pulled up. The horses looked hot and lathered. Vernon Pratt stepped down first. He was a thin, nervous man. He looked at Eli, then looked at the dirt. He didn't want to be here. The second man stepped down smoothly. Arthur Vane, the lawyer from town, the man in the brown suit. He patted the dust off his sleeves. He carried a leather valise. "Mr. Calloway," Vane said. His voice was like oiled silk, smooth, slippery. "A lovely piece of property you have here. Quiet." "It was," Eli said. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't step off the porch. Vane smiled. He opened his valise. He pulled out a thick envelope. "We appreciate you taking in the Hayes girl," Vane said. "Very neighborly. But as you know, she belongs with her family. Mr. Pratt here is her lawful guardian. We've come to take her home." Vane held out the papers. Eli didn't take them. He just looked at them. "According to the laws of the great state of Texas," Vane continued, his tone dropping an octave, becoming a threat wrapped in velvet, "withholding a minor from her legal guardian is a criminal offense. I have a court order signed by Judge Holloway. You are to surrender the child immediately." Vernon coughed. "Eli, just hand her over. Don't make trouble." Eli looked at Vernon. You don't even like the girl, Vernon. You made her sleep in the dirt. Why do you suddenly want her back? Vernon opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked nervously at Vane. Vane smoothly stepped in. Family matters are complicated, Mr. Calloway. The law, however, is very simple. Read the order. I'll read it, Eli said. But first I'm going to talk to the child. She is a minor. She has no say in the matter. I didn't ask if she had a say, Eli cut him off. The gravel was back in his voice. I said I'm going to talk to her. Vane narrowed his eyes. The polite mask slipped just for a second. Make it quick. Eli turned. He walked into the house. The screen door slammed shut behind him. Nora was standing by the kitchen table. Her small hands were balled into fists at her sides. Eli knelt down. He looked her right in the eye. Do you want to go back with your Uncle Vernon? Nora shook her head. He doesn't want me there. People know when they aren't wanted. Did he hurt you? No, but... Nora hesitated. She looked at the front door, then back to Eli. There were men who came to Uncle Vernon's house, twice. They sat in the parlor. I don't like the way they looked at me, like they were doing math in their heads. Eli felt a cold spike of dread. Do you remember what they looked like? One was big. He had a scar right here on his neck. Nora touched her own collarbone. The other one was the man outside the store yesterday. The one in the brown vest. The one with the cane. Eli went still. Arthur Vane had been at Vernon's house. Nora, Eli said softly, when your father fell from the barn roof, did you see anything? Nora looked down at her new boots. Her chin trembled. Just once. I saw the man with the scar, she whispered. He was standing under the roof before Papa fell. He was holding papers. It all clicked. The land, the water, the sudden death, the rapid legal guardianship. It wasn't an accident. It was a land grab, and Hiram Gould was pulling all the strings. Eli stood up. His face was granite. He walked back out onto the porch. Vane looked up, expecting the child. Eli stood alone. I'm not handing the child over today, Eli said. Vernon panicked. Eli, you can't do that. That's a lawful paper. Vane put a hand on Vernon's chest, silencing him. The lawyer looked up at Eli. There was no more smiling. You are making a very serious mistake, Mr. Calloway. You are a civilian. You are interfering with lawful procedure. I will return with the sheriff. And when I do, you will be arrested, and the child will be taken by force. Bring him, Eli said. But right now, get off my land. Vane stared at him for a long, calculating moment. He slid the papers back into his valise. He tipped his hat. Good day, Mr. Calloway. They got back in the buggy. The horses kicked up dirt as they wheeled around and headed back toward town. Eli watched the dust trail. He knew what he had just done. He had just declared war against the most powerful man in Comanche County. That night, Eli didn't sleep. At midnight, he saddled Sergeant. He left his rifle with Maggie. Keep the doors locked. Don't open them for anyone but me. He rode the 10 miles to Harlan Creek in the dark. The town was dead asleep. No lights in the saloon, no lamps in the mercantile. But at the very edge of town, a single lantern burned on the porch of the small white church. Reverend Samuel Cole sat in a rocking chair. He was 67 years old. His face was a map of deep lines and sunspots. He wore a simple black suit. He was reading a thick Bible by the yellow light. Eli tied Sergeant to the fence. He walked up the wooden steps. Cole didn't look up immediately. He finished his page, placed a ribbon marker on it, and gently closed the book. I wondered how long it would take you to come down off that hill, Eli, Cole said. His voice was a deep, resonant baritone. Eli sat on the wooden railing. He looked out at the dark street. Daniel Hayes, Eli said. No preamble. What do you know about how he died? Reverend Cole sighed. He took off his reading glasses. I know he didn't slip, the old man said quietly. Wade Sutter was drinking at the saloon the night it happened. He talked too much, bragged about a job well done out at the Hayes place. Sutter works for Gould. Everyone in this town works for Gould, Eli, whether they know it or not. He wants the land, the water under it. Cole nodded. And he needed Daniel out of the way to get it. Now he needs the child under his thumb so he can control the deed until she comes of age. Eli gripped the porch railing. The wood dug into his calluses. He brought a court order today, signed by the judge. He brought his lawyer. He's making it look entirely legal. Reverend Cole leaned forward in his rocking chair. The chair stopped moving. The old man looked Eli dead in the eyes. The tired pastor was gone. In his place was a man of fierce, uncompromising moral clarity. Eli, the law in this town has been bent, Cole said, his voice ringing with a quiet, undeniable authority. Men like Hiram Gould buy ink and paper to hide their sins. But you must remember the law was born to protect human rights, not the property of wealthy men. A society that allows the strong to trample the weak, stripping them of their land and lives, is a society that is already dead inside. The words struck Eli like a physical blow. They echoed in the quiet night. I have the child, Eli said. But I don't have proof. Just a 7-year-old's word against a bank. You have more than that, Cole said. He stood up. He walked to the edge of the porch, looking out at the sleeping town. Daniel Hayes came to me 3 months ago. He knew something was wrong. He wrote out a will, a legal testament. It leaves everything strictly to Nora and bypasses Vernon Pratt entirely. Eli looked up, stunned. Where is it? He took the original to the land office in Fort Worth to have it registered. He kept the receipt. I signed as a witness. If you can prove that will exists, Gould's guardianship papers are void. The whole scheme falls apart. If Gould knows about that will, then the child isn't just an inconvenience, Cole finished gravely. She's a threat to his entire empire. Eli stood up. He looked back down the road toward his ranch, toward Nora. I need to send a telegram to Fort Worth, Eli said. To a federal judge I used to know. A man Gould can't buy. Do it, Cole said. But Eli, Gould won't wait for the courts. If he realizes you're fighting back, he'll send Sutter. And he won't come with paperwork next time. Eli touched the brim of his hat. He stepped off the porch into the darkness. Let him come, Eli said. He swung up onto Sergeant. He spurred the horse into the night, riding fast. He had to get home. He had a family to protect. The next few days brought a strange, fragile peace to the ranch. The kind of peace you get just before a Texas thunderstorm. The air is sweet. The sky is clear. But you can feel the pressure dropping in your bones. You know it won't last. For Eli, it was a sudden shift in the current. He had spent 4 years floating in dead water. Now there was a pull, a direction. He didn't talk much. That wasn't his way. But he stopped looking past people. He started looking at them. The morning was cool. A heavy dew clung to the buffalo grass. Eli stepped off the porch. He held a cup of black coffee. Nora was already out in the yard. She was crouched down near the edge of the horse corral. She was perfectly still, just staring at the mud near the water trough. Eli walked over. He didn't make a sound. He just stood a few feet behind her, looking over her shoulder. Deputy was out here, Nora said. She didn't turn around. She just knew Eli was there. How do you know? Eli asked. Paw prints? She pointed a small, dirty finger at the mud. They go toward the fence, and then they come back. But there's a difference. Eli took a sip of his coffee. Tell me. Going out, the prints are close together, regular, like he was just walking. But coming back, the dirt is kicked up at the back of the print. The toes are dug in deeper. He was running, probably chasing that fat prairie dog that lives under the woodpile. Eli looked down. She was exactly right. "You have a good eye," Eli said. Nora stood up. She wiped her hands on her dress. "My father taught me a little. He said the dirt always tells a story, if you know how to read the ink." Eli nodded. He was right. But he missed one thing. Nora looked up, curious. "What?" Eli crouched down. He pointed to a faint, sweeping mark right next to the running paw prints. A light brush in the mud. "He was running," Eli said. "But he was happy about it. That mark right there, that's a tail wag dragging the ground on a hard turn. He didn't catch the prairie dog, but he had a good time trying." Nora stared at the mark. Then she looked at Eli. A slow, genuine smile spread across her face. It was the first time he had seen her truly smile. It lit up her whole face. It made her look like a 7-year-old girl again, not a weary traveler carrying the weight of the world. She sat back on an overturned wooden bucket. She looked at him for a long time. "You're different from Uncle Vernon," Nora said softly. "You're different from the men in town, too." "How's that?" "Grown-ups usually tell children to stay quiet because they don't know anything. They just tell us what to do and expect us to vanish until dinner." Nora sat up very straight. Her voice was clear, ringing with the echo of her father's teachings. "Thank you for not doing that. Respect shouldn't be measured by age or height, Mr. Calloway. Listening to someone is the highest way to prove you view them as an equal human being." Eli froze. The coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. He looked at this little girl, barely tall enough to reach his belt buckle, speaking with a clarity that most preachers couldn't muster on a Sunday morning. Daniel Hayes hadn't just raised a daughter. He had raised a conscience. "Your father," Eli said, his voice thick. "He was a very smart man." "He was," Nora agreed. She looked out toward the horizon. "I miss him." "I know." That afternoon they worked on the south fence. Eli drove the posts. Nora held the wire. They didn't talk much. The rhythm of the work was enough. Clink of the hammer, the stretch of the wire, the heat of the sun. Around 3 o'clock, Eli wiped his brow. He looked over at Nora. She was sitting on a cedar post, kicking her feet gently. She looked at him. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "you look like a man who forgot what it feels like to matter to somebody." Eli lowered the hammer. He let out a long breath. "What makes you say that?" "When my papa was alive," Nora said, looking down at her hands, "every morning I woke up, he was already standing by the kitchen door, not because he liked waking up early, he liked to sleep. He stood there because he wanted to make sure I saw someone waiting for me when I opened my eyes. Right now there's nobody at your kitchen door." Eli swallowed hard. "Maggie's there." "Maggie is there for Maggie," Nora said simply. "She's a good lady. But Papa, he was there for me." Eli didn't have an answer for that, because it was the truth. When Clara died, the door had been empty. He had made sure of it. The day faded into dusk. The sky turned bruised purple, then black. That night, the house was quiet. Too quiet. Eli was sitting at the kitchen table. He had a kerosene lamp turned low. He was cleaning his revolver. The oily smell of hops number 9 filled the room. It was a comforting smell, familiar. Around midnight, he heard it. It wasn't loud, just a soft, muffled sound coming from the spare room down the hall. Eli put the gun down. He wiped his hands on a rag. He walked silently down the hallway. He stopped outside Nora's door. He leaned his head against the pine wood. She was crying. Not a tantrum. Not a loud wail. It was the deep, rhythmic sobbing of someone who realizes in the dark that the person they want most in the world is never coming back. Eli's hand hovered over the brass doorknob. He wanted to go in. He wanted to tell her it would be all right. But he knew it was a lie. He knew better than anyone, so he didn't open the door. He didn't intrude on her grief. Instead, he slowly slid down the wall. He sat on the floorboards right outside her door. He stretched his long legs out. He leaned his head back against the wall. "You don't have to be quiet," Eli said. He spoke softly, just loud enough to carry through the wood. The crying stopped instantly. A hitch of breath. "Are you awake?" Nora's small voice came through the door. "I'm awake." A long silence. "Mr. Calloway?" "Yeah. When you lose the people you love, does the missing them ever get smaller? Or does it just change shape?" Eli closed his eyes. He saw Clara's blue bonnet. He saw Thomas's tiny shoes. "It changes shape," Eli said. He told the absolute truth. "At first, it's like a prairie fire. It burns everything up. It takes your breath away. You think you're going to burn to ash right along with it." He paused. He listened to the quiet breathing on the other side of the door. "Then," he continued, "it turns into a heavy stone. You carry it in your chest. It drags you down, makes it hard to walk, hard to stand up." "And now?" Nora asked. "Now, it's like a room in a house, a room with the door closed. It's always there. I know exactly what's inside, but I don't have to walk into it every single day." "Can you choose not to walk in?" "Sometimes, if you have a reason to stay in the hallway." He heard the rustle of blankets. Nora was lying back down. "I miss my papa's hands," she whispered. "I miss the way his voice sounded when he read the Bible. I'm scared I'm going to forget it." "You won't," Eli said. "You'll just remember him differently when you're grown." "Mr. Calloway?" "Yeah. Thank you for not opening the door, and thank you for sitting outside it." Eli sat there in the dark hallway for a long time. Deputy trotted down the hall and curled up across his boots. Eli rested his hand on the dog's head. He looked at the closed door. He was starting to care. It terrified him. And for the first time in 4 years, it felt good. The kerosene lamp flickered. It cast long, frantic shadows against the kitchen walls. It was 2 a.m. The house was dead silent. Maggie was asleep in her room off the pantry. Nora was asleep down the hall. Eli sat at the heavy oak table. He had a pot of black coffee sitting on a cast-iron trivet. He hadn't touched it. In front of him lay Daniel Hayes' leather notebook. He had read it twice before. He had read about the water. He had read about the men coming around. He had read about Hiram Gould. But tonight, Eli wasn't looking at the names. He was looking at the dates. He flipped the brittle pages carefully. His thumb traced the ink. February 14th, 1874. Daniel's handwriting was neat, slanted slightly to the right. "Man named Gould came by the fence line today. Offered to buy the south acreage. Double the going rate. I told him the land wasn't for sale. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He said he'd be in touch." Eli turned the page. March 3rd, 1874. "Gould sent 2 men this time. Rough sorts. Didn't make an offer, just asked if I had a family to think about. I showed them my rifle. They rode off. I need to register the will in Fort Worth. Soon." Eli stopped breathing. March 1874. He stared at the ink until it blurred. The numbers seemed to lift off the page and brand themselves into his retinas. March 1874. That was the month Eli had been riding the circuit. That was the month he was closing in on a gang of cattle rustlers working out of Hays City. A gang that everyone knew was bankrolled by a shadow financier. A gang that had realized the marshal was getting too close. A gang that decided to send a message. March 14th, 1874. That was the night his ranch burned. That was the night Clara and Thomas died. The pieces slammed together with the force of a train wreck. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't random outlaw violence. Hiram Gould had been clearing the board. He was making his move on the county. Daniel Hayes was a stubborn farmer sitting on water. Eli Calloway was a marshal asking too many questions about Gould's rustling operations. Gould had struck them both in the exact same month. He killed Eli's world to stop an investigation. He waited 4 years, then killed Daniel to take the water. A cold, absolute silence descended on Eli. The trembling in his hands stopped, completely. It was replaced by a stillness that was terrifying. It was the stillness of a man who has just crossed a line in his mind and knows he can never, ever go back. He slowly closed the notebook. He stood up. He pushed the chair back. It scraped against the floorboards. The sound was loud in the quiet house, but Eli didn't care. He walked into his bedroom. He opened the heavy wooden chest at the foot of his bed. He reached past the folded blankets. He pulled out the dark leather gun belt. The twin Colt .45 revolvers rested heavy in their holsters. He strapped the belt around his waist. He checked the cylinders, fully loaded. He grabbed a box of extra cartridges and shoved them into the pockets of his long duster coat. He was going to ride into Harlan Creek. He was going to kick open the door of the bank, or the hotel, or wherever Hiram Gould was sleeping. And he was going to empty both guns into the man's chest. There would be no trial, no judge, no jury, just blood for blood. He put on his hat. He pulled the brim low over his eyes. He walked back into the kitchen, heading for the back door. "Where are you going?" The voice was small, quiet. Eli stopped. He turned. Nora was standing in the doorway of the hall. She wore a long white nightgown. She held a candle in a brass holder. The small flame illuminated her face. She looked at Eli. She looked at the heavy gun belt. She looked at his eyes. She had seen that look before. She had seen it on men passing through town, men who didn't plan on coming back. "Go back to sleep, Nora," Eli said. His voice didn't sound like his own. It was a hollow, dead sound. "You found something," she said. She didn't move. She stepped into the kitchen. "In the book, you found something about him. It's grown-up business." "No, it's not," Nora said firmly. She walked right up to him. She wasn't afraid of the guns. She wasn't afraid of the dark anger rolling off him in waves. "He killed your family, didn't he? Just like he killed my papa." Eli's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. He couldn't lie to her. "Yes. And you're going to go kill him. I'm going to end it. Tonight." Nora set the candle down on the kitchen table. She reached down to the hem of her nightgown. She reached inside the lining. There was a small, tearing sound of fabric. She pulled out a folded piece of thick, stiff paper. It had been sewn into the hem of her dress. She held it out to Eli. Eli looked at it. He didn't take it. "What is that?" "My papa gave it to me the night before he fell. He told me to sew it in. He told me to keep it hidden until I found someone I could trust with my life." She looked up at him. "It's the receipt from the land office in Fort Worth, and a sworn affidavit from Reverend Cole. It proves my papa's will is real. It proves the land is mine, and Uncle Vernon's papers are fake." Eli stared at the paper. It was the silver bullet, the legal proof that could tear Gould's empire apart in a federal court. "It's paper, Nora," Eli said, his voice hard. "Paper doesn't stop bullets. Paper doesn't bring dead people back. The only thing a man like Gould understands is the grave." Nora stepped closer. She reached out with her small hand. She didn't touch the paper. She touched the cold steel handle of Eli's revolver. Eli looked down at her hand. "Mr. Calloway," Nora said. Her voice trembled, but not from fear. It was thick with a desperate, fierce conviction. "My father died protecting this land, not to create more killers. Human life is sacred. Taking revenge with blood only turns you into a man who tramples on human rights just like Mr. Gould. We have to demand justice, not spread more cruelty." Eli froze. The words echoed in the small kitchen. They clashed violently with the roaring storm in his head. "He burned them alive, Nora," Eli whispered. The pain in his voice was a physical thing, an open, bleeding wound. "I know," Nora said. Tears welled up in her eyes, spilling over her cheeks in the candlelight. "I saw the man push my papa, I hear the sound of him hitting the ground every time I close my eyes. She grabbed the lapels of his duster coat. She held on tight. But if you go out there and murder him, she sobbed, you're just another bad man in the dark. You won't be a marshal anymore. You won't be the man my papa said knew the right thing to do. You'll just be dead. Or you'll hang. And I'll be all alone. Eli looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the terror in her eyes. Not terror of him. Terror of losing the only safe harbor she had left in the world. He looked at the piece of paper on the table, the rule of law, the difficult, slow, agonizing path of justice. Then he looked at his guns, the fast, easy path of blood. He closed his eyes. The prairie fire inside him raged, demanding oxygen, demanding fuel. But then he felt the weight of her small hands gripping his coat. Slowly, agonizingly, Eli let out a breath. The stiffness left his shoulders. He reached down and covered her small hands with his large, calloused one. "Okay," Eli whispered. He unbuckled the gun belt. It hit the floorboards with a heavy thud. He picked up the piece of paper. He folded it carefully and put it in his shirt pocket, right over his heart. "We do it the hard way," Eli said. He looked down at her. The anger was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp resolve. "We take it to the light." Nora wiped her eyes. She gave a small nod. "In the light." They had the proof, but Eli knew Hiram Gould. When Gould realized the paper game was up, he wouldn't wait for a courtroom. He would bring the violence to them. The storm wasn't over. It was just changing direction, and it was heading straight for the ranch. The paper Arthur Vane brought the next afternoon wasn't a request. It was a court order. It had Judge Holloway's signature at the bottom. The ink was thick and black. It stated that Eli Calloway was harboring a minor against the lawful wishes of her guardian. It gave him 24 hours to hand Nora over. If he didn't, he would be arrested. Sheriff Tom Burkett had ridden out with Vane to deliver it. Tom didn't look Eli in the eye. He looked at his boots. He looked at his horse. He looked everywhere but at the man standing on the porch. 24 hours, Calloway, Vane had said smoothly. Then they rode away. That was at noon. Now it was 2 in the morning. The air was dead, cold, the kind of dark that swallows the light from the stars. Inside the house, Eli didn't sleep. He sat by the window in the dark. He had his Winchester rifle across his knees. Out by the creek bed, Deputy started to growl, a low, rolling sound deep in his chest. Then the dog barked. Sharp, angry. Eli stood up. He didn't light a lantern. He heard the crunch of boots on gravel. Not one man. Several. They hadn't ridden their horses all the way up. They had tied them off out of earshot and walked in. Eli moved to the kitchen door. Maggie was already awake. She slipped into the kitchen like a shadow. She held a double-barreled shotgun. Her hands were steady. "They're here," Eli whispered. "I know," Maggie said. "I'll wake the child. Keep her in the back room, on the floor." Eli opened the back door, just a crack. 4 shadows stood in the yard. Wade Sutter was in the front. Eli recognized the broad shoulders, the heavy coat. "Calloway!" Sutter called out. His voice carried in the still night. "We ain't here to talk. Send the girl out. Nobody gets hurt." Eli stepped out onto the porch. He stayed in the shadows. He levered around into the chamber of the Winchester. The metallic clack was loud. It echoed off the barn. "You're trespassing, Wade," Eli said. His voice was calm, dead calm. "I got a court order," Sutter lied. "The sheriff has the order. You're just a hired gun standing in my yard at 2 in the morning. That makes you a trespasser. In Texas, that means I can leave you in the dirt and sleep soundly after." The shadows stopped moving. Sutter hesitated. He had 4 men, but Eli Calloway had the high ground. He had the dark. And he had a reputation that even 4 years of quiet living couldn't entirely erase. "You can't stay awake forever, Eli," Sutter sneered. "We got 24 hours. We'll just wait." Sutter whistled softly. The shadows backed up. They melted into the tree line. They didn't leave. They were just out of range, waiting for daylight, waiting for him to make a mistake. Eli went back inside. He locked the heavy oak door. He leaned against the wood. He closed his eyes. He did the math. He had a rifle and 2 revolvers. Maggie had a shotgun. Out there, Sutter had 4 men. By noon, Vane would bring the sheriff and half a dozen deputies. It was a siege, and it was a siege he couldn't win. If they stayed, the house would be surrounded. They'd burn it down, just like before. The thought made his blood turn to ice water. He pushed off the door. He made his decision. Eli walked to his bedroom. He took off his flannel shirt. He put on a heavy black shirt. He strapped on his gun belt. He pulled his long leather duster coat from the peg on the wall. He shrugged it on. The leather was heavy, familiar. He filled his pockets with extra cartridges. He grabbed his saddlebags. He walked into the kitchen. Maggie was sitting on the floor by the pantry holding the shotgun. Nora was sitting next to her, clutching her knees to her chest. "Maggie," Eli said softly. "Take her down to the root cellar. Lock it from the inside. Do not come out until the sun is high and you hear my voice." Maggie looked at him. She looked at the coat, the guns, the saddlebags. She knew that look. It was the look of a man who was tying up loose ends. "Eli," Maggie breathed. "What are you doing?" "I'm breaking the siege," Eli said. "Sutter is waiting for me to crack. He's waiting for the sun. I'm not giving him either. I'm going to Hayes City tonight." Hayes City, where Hiram Gould slept in a fine hotel room. "You're going to kill him," Maggie said. It wasn't a question. "I'm going to cut the head off the snake. Once Gould is dead, Sutter and the rest will scatter. The law will drop the case. You and the child will be safe." Eli turned toward the back door. He put his hand on the brass knob. He was a broken man. He had nothing left to lose. Dying to protect them felt right. It felt clean. It was the only way he knew how to fix things. A small, cold hand grabbed the heavy leather of his duster coat. Eli stopped. He looked down. Nora was standing there. Her bare feet were on the cold floorboards. Her knuckles were white where she gripped his coat. "Please don't go," Nora whispered. Her voice shook. "I have to, Nora," Eli said. He tried to keep his voice steady. "It's the only way you and Maggie survive. I'm going to make sure he never hurts anyone again. I'm a broken man anyway. I don't have anything left to lose." He tried to gently pry her fingers off his coat. Nora held on tighter. She looked up at him. Tears were streaming down her face, but her eyes were fiercely, brightly angry. "No," she cried out, her voice breaking the quiet of the kitchen. "Throwing your life away for someone else isn't protecting them. My dad told me that. He said every life is equal and precious." Eli froze. Her words hit him like a physical strike. Nora was crying hard now, the fear and the grief finally spilling over. "If you leave, you're throwing away your own life just to hurt him. And you'll leave me all alone again. Safety means nothing if the person I love most isn't by my side." She yanked on his coat, forcing him to look her dead in the eye. "My father didn't die so you could throw your life away, Mr. Calloway. Living for others is what true responsibility is, sir, not dying for them." The silence in the kitchen was absolute. The only sound was Nora's ragged breathing. Eli stared at the little girl. "Living for others is what true responsibility is." The words echoed in his head. They stripped away his excuses. They tore down the romantic, tragic lie he was telling himself. He wasn't going to Hayes City to protect them. He was going there because he was tired. He was going there because dying in a blaze of gunfire was easier than waking up tomorrow and trying to be a father. It was easier than trying to live with the fear of losing someone again. He looked at her small hands gripping his coat. He looked at Maggie, who had tears in her own eyes. Eli let go of the doorknob. The heavy leather saddlebag slipped from his shoulder. They hit the floorboards with a dull, heavy thud. He dropped to his knees. He was eye level with Nora. He didn't say anything. He just reached out and pulled her into a tight, fierce hug. He buried his face in her shoulder. His broad shoulders shook. Nora wrapped her small arms around his neck. She buried her face in his heavy leather coat. "I won't go," Eli whispered roughly. His voice was thick with emotion. "I won't ride away. I promise you." He held her there in the dark kitchen. The cowboy didn't ride away. He chose to stay. He chose the terrifying, exhausting, beautiful responsibility of living. When he finally stood up, his eyes were clear. The death wish was gone. "Maggie," Eli said, "put the coffee on. We aren't hiding in the cellar." "What are we doing?" Maggie asked, wiping her eyes. "We wait for the sun," Eli said. He unbuttoned his coat. "And then we go to town, in the daylight. We do this the right way." The sun came up over Comanche County like a brass coin. Hot, bright, unforgiving. Wade Sutter and his men were gone. They had slipped away before dawn, realizing Eli wasn't going to make a break for it in the dark. They would be back with the sheriff at noon. Eli didn't wait for noon. At 8 o'clock, he hitched the wagon. He helped Maggie and Nora up onto the wooden bench. He didn't wear the long duster coat. He didn't carry the rifle. He just wore his standard gun belt. His badge, the faded silver star, was pinned to his shirt. He drove the wagon straight to Jim Rafter's place first. Jim was an old miner. He knew the dirt in this county better than anyone. He was sitting on his porch drinking coffee when Eli pulled up. Eli didn't get down. He just looked at the old man. "Jim," Eli said, "you know what's under Daniel Hayes' land. You know why Gould wants it." Jim looked down at his coffee cup. "I know, Eli, but the bank holds the note on my place. I speak up, Gould calls in the loan. I lose everything." Eli nodded. He didn't yell. He didn't shame the man. "I'm taking the Hayes girl into town," Eli said. "I'm going to stand in the street and tell the truth. I'd like it if you stood with me, but if you can't, I understand." Eli flicked the reins. The wagon rolled on. Jim watched them go. His knuckles turned white around his coffee cup. Eli went to Pete Larson next, the retired land clerk. Then he went to Daniel Hayes's closest neighbors, two men who had seen Wade Sutter lurking around the barn the day Daniel fell. Eli gave them all the same speech, no threats, no begging, just the truth. By 10 o'clock, the wagon rolled into Harlan Creek. The town was already busy. Wagons were parked outside the mercantile. Men were standing outside the saloon. Eli pulled his wagon right up to the front of the bank, right in the center of town. He tied off the horses. He helped Nora and Maggie down. The street went quiet. People stopped talking. The blacksmith stopped hammering. Everyone watched Eli Calloway walk up the wooden steps of the bank. The glass door opened before Eli could touch the handle. Hiram Gould stepped out. He wore a gray pinstripe suit. His silver hair was perfectly combed. Arthur Vane stood just behind his right shoulder. Gould looked down at Eli. He smiled. It was a cold, practiced thing. "Mr. Calloway," Gould said loudly, ensuring the people on the street could hear, "I see you've brought the child, very sensible. The sheriff was just getting ready to ride out to collect her." Eli didn't smile back. He stood at the bottom of the steps. He kept his hands away from his gun belt. "I didn't bring her for you, Gould," Eli said. His voice carried across the dusty street. "I brought her to send a telegram to Fort Worth, to District Judge Marcus Webb." Gould's smile faltered, just a fraction. "Webb is a busy man," Vane interjected smoothly. "He doesn't concern himself with local guardianship disputes." "He concerns himself with forged land deeds," Eli said clearly. "He concerns himself with wills that were legally registered and then conveniently ignored by a bought and paid for local judge." The murmurs started in the street. People were listening. Gould gripped his silver-tipped cane. He stepped closer to the edge of the porch. He lowered his voice so only Eli could hear. "Calloway, you are making a terrible mistake. Your wife and son, that was a tragic accident. I would hate to see another accident happen to the people you care about. It was a direct threat, wrapped in polite concern." Eli didn't blink. He looked straight into Gould's eyes. "You're done hiding behind accidents, Hiram. I have the receipt for the will. I have the witness. The federal court is coming, and I'm going to watch them put you in chains." Gould stared at him. The mask of the polite banker vanished. Pure, venomous hatred stared back at Eli. "Sheriff!" Gould shouted, turning his head. Tom Burkett was standing across the street, near the jailhouse. He looked miserable. He slowly walked across the dirt road, his hand resting nervously on his gun belt. "Arrest him, Tom," Gould ordered. "He's violating a court order. He's threatening a prominent citizen." Burkett stopped a few feet away. He looked at Eli. He looked at Nora. Then he looked up at Gould. "Eli," Burkett started, his voice cracked. Just hand the girl over. I got a paper here. I gotta serve it." Eli turned away from Gould. He faced the sheriff. This was the linchpin. If Burkett folded, the town folded. "Tom," Eli said gently. He didn't sound angry. He sounded sad. "You're a father. You have a boy in Kansas City. Imagine him standing where Nora is standing." "Don't do that, Eli," Burkett whispered. "Gould owns my mortgage. He owns this whole town." Eli stepped closer to the sheriff. He spoke loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear every word. "A badge isn't just a piece of tin, Tom. You wear it to protect the people who can't protect themselves." Eli pointed a finger at Burkett's chest. "Every human being is born with equal rights before the law, whether they're a dirt farmer or a banking tycoon." Burkett swallowed hard. He looked around. The townspeople were watching him. "If you take that paper," Eli continued, his voice ringing with absolute conviction, "and you turn a blind eye to the truth, it means you are allowing evil to strip away the right to life from your own fellow man. You are saying the law only belongs to the rich. Is that the kind of lawman you are, Tom?" Burkett stared at Eli. His chest heaved. He looked down at the court order in his trembling hand. "Sheriff!" Gould barked from the porch. "Do your job!" Burkett looked up at the banker. The fear in the sheriff's eyes was slowly being replaced by something else. Shame. And then a spark of anger. Before Burkett could answer, a voice cut through the tension. "The sheriff isn't the only one who has to make a choice today." Eli turned. Reverend Samuel Cole was walking down the middle of the street. He carried no Bible today. He walked with his head held high. And he wasn't alone. Walking right beside him was Jim Rafter. Behind them was Pete Larson. Then the Hayes neighbors. Then the blacksmith. A dozen men. Then 24. Ordinary, tired, dirt-poor men and women of Harlan Creek. They stepped off the boardwalks. They stepped out of the stores. They walked into the middle of the dusty street, forming a solid wall behind Eli, Maggie, and Nora. They didn't have guns drawn. They didn't have pitchforks. They just had their presence. Jim Rafter stopped right beside Eli. He looked up at Gould. "I know what's under that land, Mr. Gould," Jim said loudly. "I'm ready to swear to it in a federal court." Pete Larson stepped up next. "And I know how you forced Vernon Pratt to sign those papers, Vane. I kept the records." Hiram Gould looked at the crowd. The color drained from his face. He was a man who understood numbers. He understood leverage. He could buy a judge. He could intimidate a sheriff. He could hire a thug like Wade Sutter. But he couldn't buy an entire town that had finally decided they had had enough. Eli looked down at Nora. She was holding Maggie's hand, looking at the crowd of people standing behind them. "You see that?" Eli said softly to her. "That's what happens when you stand in the light." The cowboy hadn't ridden away. He had stayed. And because he stayed, a whole town remembered how to stand up. The street was dead quiet. You could hear the wind pushing dust against the wooden boardwalks. You could hear the creak of the saloon sign swinging on its iron hinges. Hiram Gould stood on the raised porch of the bank. He looked at the crowd. 24 people. Then 3. Store owners, dirt farmers, women in faded cotton dresses, men with calluses on their hands thick as boot leather. They stood behind Eli Calloway. They stood behind a little girl with bandaged feet. They didn't have guns drawn. They didn't shout. They just stood there. Gould's face lost its color. It went the shade of old parchment. He looked at Arthur Vane. The lawyer took a slow step backward, putting distance between himself and his boss. Gould looked at Sheriff Tom Burkett. "Arrest him," Gould ordered. His voice shook, just a fraction. But out here in the quiet, everyone heard it. Burkett stood in the middle of the road. He looked at the fraudulent court order in his trembling hand. He looked at Eli. He looked at the wall of ordinary people. Wade Sutter didn't like the silence. He didn't like the way the wind was blowing. Sutter stepped off the bank porch. He moved fast. He was a big man, built like a brick wall. He put his hand on the heavy iron of his revolver. "The sheriff gave you an order, Calloway," Sutter growled. "You and the old man step aside. We're taking the girl." Eli didn't flinch. He didn't reach for his gun. He just stood his ground. "You aren't taking anyone, Wade," Eli said. His voice was calm, steady as a rock. Sutter's upper lip curled. He drew his gun. It was a fast draw. The heavy click of the hammer cocking echoed like a thunderclap. But he didn't aim at Eli. He aimed right at Reverend Cole's chest. "Shut your mouth, old man," Sutter barked. "Tell these sheep to go home, or you bleed right here in the dirt." The crowd gasped. A few people stepped back, but the Reverend didn't move. Time seemed to stop. Then a sound cut through the tension. Leather sliding against leather. It was Sheriff Tom Burkett. He had drawn his gun, but he wasn't aiming at Eli. Burkett stepped forward. He leveled his Colt revolver squarely at Wade Sutter's head. "Drop it, Wade," Burkett said. His voice cracked on the first word, but it settled into iron on the second. Sutter froze. He looked at the sheriff like the man had grown a second head. "Burkett, what are you doing?" Sutter snarled. "Put that away before you get hurt." "I'm doing my job," Burkett said. His hand stopped shaking. "Drop the gun, now." Before Sutter could answer, movement caught his eye. Down in the street, stepping out from behind Eli's long coat, was Nora. Maggie tried to grab her shoulder, but the little girl slipped past. She walked forward. She didn't hide. She didn't cry. She walked right up to the space between the men. She looked up at Wade Sutter. She looked right at the jagged scar running down the side of his neck. Sutter looked down at her. For the first time, the big man looked unsure. "I remember you," Nora said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was clear. It carried all the way to the bank porch. "I remember your face," Nora said. "You were standing under the barn roof, you and another man. I saw you from the kitchen window. I was 5 years old, but I remember that scar. You pushed my papa." Total silence. The kind of silence that rings in your ears. Gould gripped the porch rail. His empire was made of paper, and this little girl was holding a match to it. "She's lying," Gould shouted. He pointed a shaking finger at Nora. "She's a child. She doesn't know what she's saying." Reverend Cole stepped forward. He stepped right in front of the barrel of Sutter's gun, placing himself between the enforcer and the little girl. The old pastor looked up at Hiram Gould. "Mr. Gould," the Reverend said, his voice deep and ringing with absolute authority, "your money might buy paper. It might buy men in fine suits, but it cannot buy human dignity." Gould stared down at him, breathing hard. "A person's dignity isn't priced in land or silver," Cole continued, speaking to Gould but making sure the whole town heard the lesson. "It is measured in how they treat their fellow man. You looked at Daniel Hayes and saw an obstacle. You looked at this child and saw a problem to be erased. But your cruelty ends here today, because compassion and unity will always be bigger than the barrel of a gun." Sutter looked at the old man. He looked at the sheriff aiming a gun at his head. He looked at the 24 men behind Eli, who were now quietly pulling their own rifles from their wagons. Sutter wasn't a brave man. He was just a bully, and bullies only fight when they have the upper hand. He slowly lowered his revolver. He uncocked the hammer. He let the gun drop into the dust at his feet. Burkett walked forward. He grabbed Sutter roughly by the collar and shoved him toward the jailhouse. "Get moving," Burkett said. Up on the porch, Arthur Vane quietly set his leather valise down. He held his hands up, showing he was unarmed. He was already planning his defense strategy. He was already figuring out how to blame it all on Gould. Hiram Gould stood alone. He looked at the town he thought he owned. He looked at the people he thought were sheep. They stared back at him, not with fear, with pity. Eli didn't draw his gun. He didn't need to. He just turned his back on Hiram Gould. He knelt down in the dirt next to Nora. The adrenaline was fading. The little girl's shoulders suddenly slumped. She looked incredibly small. "Are you okay?" Eli asked softly. Nora looked at him. Her eyes filled with tears. She didn't sob. The tears just spilled over, cutting clean tracks through the dust on her cheeks. "Mr. Calloway," she whispered, "I'm so tired." "I know," Eli said. He reached out. He didn't hesitate this time. "You have every right to be." He placed his large, calloused hand on the top of her head. It was a gentle touch, a promise. Nora leaned forward. She rested her forehead against his chest. She grabbed a fistful of his shirt. She let out a long, shuddering breath. It was over. The running was over. The hiding was over. Eli picked her up. He carried her toward the wagon. Maggie was waiting. She had tears in her own eyes. She took the reins. They drove out of town. The sun was high. The sky was wide and blue. For the first time in a long time, the road home felt like it actually led somewhere. 10 days later, the dust finally settled. The men from Fort Worth arrived on the morning stagecoach. A young deputy U.S. Marshal with a sharp eye, a clerk with a stack of ledgers, and District Judge Marcus Webb. Webb was an older man. He had a thick white mustache and a no-nonsense way of walking. He set up his temporary courtroom inside the Harlan Creek Church. It took 3 days to untangle the mess. They took statements. They read the original will Reverend Cole provided. They looked at the fake documents Vernon Pratt had been forced to sign. Wade Sutter talked. He talked a lot. Once he realized Gould wasn't going to save him, he traded everything he knew for a promise that he wouldn't hang. He confirmed Gould gave the order on Daniel Hayes. When it was all laid out, it was ugly. It was the worst kind of greed. On the 4th morning, Judge Webb rendered his decision. The church was packed. Every pew was full. People stood in the aisles. Eli sat in the front row. Nora sat next to him, her feet swinging slightly above the floorboards. She wore a new blue dress Maggie had made for her. Hiram Gould sat at the defendant's table. He looked older. The crisp suit looked baggy on him now. Judge Webb looked down from the pulpit. He didn't use a gavel. He just spoke. "The transfer of the Hayes property is hereby declared null and void," Webb announced. The clerk furiously took notes. "The land and the water rights beneath it belong solely to Nora Hayes, as dictated by her father's true and lawful testament." A quiet murmur of approval rippled through the church. Webb held up a hand. The room went silent. The judge looked directly at Hiram Gould. "Mr. Gould, you built a fortune on the backs of honest people. You used the law as a weapon to steal what you could not buy." Webb leaned forward. His voice carried the weight of the entire federal government. "This system was not established so the rich could devour the poor," Webb stated, his words ringing off the wooden beams. "The case of little Nora Hayes is a stark reminder to every man with a fat wallet and a cold heart. Human rights are inviolable. They are not up for negotiation, and greed can never ever be an excuse for crimes against humanity." Webb signed the paper. He handed it to the deputy marshal. "Take him to Fort Worth," Webb said. "Let a federal jury decide how many years he spends in the dark." Gould stood up. He didn't look at Eli. He didn't look at Nora. He just put his hands out to receive the heavy iron cuffs. It was over. That afternoon, the air felt different back at the ranch. Lighter. Eli walked down the hallway. His boots sounded hollow on the floorboards. He stopped at the door at the end of the hall, the closed door. He reached into his pocket. He pulled out the brass key. He hadn't used it in 4 years. He slid it into the lock. It turned with a heavy click. Eli opened the door. The room smelled like dried lavender, like memories. He didn't feel the sudden crushing weight on his chest. He didn't feel the prairie fire burning up his lungs. He just felt quiet. He walked over to the washstand. He looked at the pale blue bonnet. He looked at the tiny leather shoes. He reached out. His hand didn't tremble. He picked up the piece of paper pinned to the wall. Eli, eat breakfast before you head out. I mean it. See, Eli smiled. A small, genuine smile. I ate breakfast today, Clara, he whispered to the empty room. Maggie made eggs. I didn't let them get cold. He put the paper down. He touched the brim of the blue bonnet. A gentle goodbye. Not a goodbye to his love for them. Just a goodbye to the pain of losing them. He walked out of the room. He didn't lock the door behind him. He left it open. Just a crack, letting the air in. Out on the front porch, Judge Webb was drinking a glass of Maggie's iced tea. Eli walked out and sat on the wooden railing. You have a fine place here, Eli, Webb said. Quiet. It's getting louder, Eli said. He looked out at the yard. Nora was throwing a stick for deputy. The old dog was too tired to fetch it, so he just chewed on it where it landed. Nora laughed. There's one piece of business left, Webb said. He pulled a folded document from his coat pocket. The girl has her land, but she's 7 years old. She can't live alone. And I'm not sending her back to Vernon Pratt. He's facing his own charges for fraud. Webb looked at Eli. I need a legal guardian. Someone to manage the land in a trust until she's 18. Someone to make sure she learns to read, write, and ride. Webb tapped the paper. I drew up the papers with your name on them, Eli, if you want it. Eli looked at the paper. Then he looked out at the yard. Nora had stopped playing with the dog. She was walking toward the porch. She had heard the judge. She walked up the wooden steps. She stood in front of Eli. She looked at him with those ancient, serious eyes. Do you want this? Eli asked her quietly. You have a say, Nora. It's your life. I decided the first night I got here, Nora said plainly. You were 7 years old. You made a decision about your whole life in one night? Nora nodded. I listened to the way you talked to your dog. A man who talks polite to an old dog isn't a bad man to live with. Inside the house, Maggie let out a loud snort of laughter. Eli shook his head. He couldn't help it. He smiled broadly. He reached out. He took the pen from Judge Webb. He laid the paper flat against the porch railing. He signed his name. Eli Calloway. It was official. Late that afternoon, when the sun was starting to dip low and paint the sky in strokes of orange and purple, Eli saddled Sergeant. He didn't ask Nora to come. This was a trip he had to make alone. He rode 5 miles out, past the town, up a small grassy rise to a plot of land surrounded by a wrought iron fence. The Harlan Creek Cemetery. He tied the horse. He took his hat off. He walked through the gate. He walked to the far corner under the shade of a large live oak tree. 2 white headstones stood side by side. Clara May Calloway. Thomas Eli Calloway. Eli stood there. The wind rustled the leaves above him. He didn't drop to his knees. He didn't weep. The stone in his chest was still there. It always would be. But it wasn't crushing him anymore. He knew how to carry it now. Her name is Nora, Eli said softly. She's 7. She talks like a school teacher, but really she's just a little girl who needed someone to stand by the kitchen door in the morning. He looked at Clara's name carved in the stone. You'd like her, Clara. You'd say she's too stubborn for her own good. Then you'd teach her how to bake. He looked at Thomas's stone. She's a good kid, Tommy. She's got a brave heart. Eli took a deep breath. The air smelled like wild sage and dry earth. I don't know if I'm doing this right, Eli confessed to the quiet graves. But I know I couldn't let her ride away. I couldn't go back into the dark. He reached out. He rested his hand on the top of Clara's headstone. The stone was warm from the afternoon sun. "You were right," Eli whispered. "I ate breakfast before I headed out." He put his hat back on. He turned around. He walked back to his horse. He swung up into the saddle. He turned Sergeant toward home. He had a fence to mend tomorrow. He had a horse to brush. He had a little girl who was going to ask him 100 questions before noon. He had a life to live, and he was finally ready to live it. 3 years. Out here on the Texas plains, 3 years is enough time for the world to change its face completely. It was the spring of 1881. Spring in Comanche County doesn't just arrive. It kicks the door open. The buffalo grass grew thick and green. Bluebonnets painted the rolling hills in massive, sprawling strokes of color. The air smelled like damp earth and wild sweetgrass. The Callaway Ranch was alive. It wasn't a quiet, dying place anymore. It hummed. 40 head of healthy cattle grazed in the north pasture. The fence lines were straight. The cedar posts were strong. The water pumped clear and cold from the deep well. It was 5 o'clock in the morning. The sky was just starting to turn a bruised, pale purple in the east. Eli stepped off the back porch. He held a tin cup of black coffee. His boots crunched on the gravel. He wore a faded blue shirt and suspenders. His face was weathered, lined by the sun and the wind, but the deep, dark hollows under his eyes were gone. He didn't walk with a heavy limp in his soul anymore. He just walked like a man with chores to do. He headed toward the stables. Before he even reached the heavy wooden doors, he stopped. He heard a voice. It was a clear, bright voice, speaking in a low, conversational tone. Eli leaned against the doorframe. He looked inside. Nora was 10 years old now. She had grown like a weed. Her hair was braided neatly down her back. She wore a pair of sturdy denim overalls Maggie had stitched together for her. She was standing on an overturned crate so she could reach Sergeant's back with a curry comb. The old horse was half asleep, enjoying the brushing. "I finished Chapter 3 last night, Sergeant," Nora was saying to the horse. Her tone was dead serious. "It's a tough book. Reverend Cole said it was written by a man named Dickens. He uses too many words to describe a chair. But I think I understand it better than I did last week." Sergeant snorted. He shifted his weight. "I know," Nora agreed. "It's not as good as the stories about the cowboys. But Mr. Larson says if I'm going to manage my own land one day, I need a vocabulary, whatever that means." Eli stood in the shadows. He took a slow sip of his coffee. He didn't interrupt. He just watched her. She wasn't the broken, hollowed-out 7-year-old who had walked 11 miles on bleeding feet. She was a kid, a real, living, breathing kid. She went to the small schoolhouse in Harlan Creek. She read faster than anyone in her class, but she didn't brag. She just kept reading. She spent her afternoons at the land office with old Pete Larson, learning how to read a deed, learning how to spot a bad contract, learning how to protect what was hers. She was growing up right. She had the foundation of a child who had seen the worst of the world, but she hadn't let it turn her mean. She knew how to be serious when the wind blew hard, but she also knew how to laugh when the dog chased his own tail. Nora stopped brushing. She turned around. She saw Eli standing in the doorway. "You're up early," Eli said. "You're later than usual," Nora shot back. She stepped off the crate. She patted Sergeant's neck. "I wanted to get the brushing done before the sun got too hot. He gets cranky when he's hot." "He's old," Eli said, stepping into the barn. "Old men get cranky." Nora smiled. "You don't," Eli chuckled. A real deep sound that settled comfortably in his chest. "Give me a few more years." He picked up a pitchfork. He started turning the hay. Nora grabbed a smaller fork. They worked side by side. They didn't need to fill the air with empty talk. The rhythm of the work was a conversation all its own. The day rolled on. Good, hard work. When the sun finally started to dip toward the western horizon, the sky caught fire. Orange, gold, and deep, violent red. It was the best time of day on the ranch. Eli sat on the front porch. He was sitting in a wooden rocking chair he'd built last winter. Deputy was lying across his boots. The dog was truly old now. His muzzle was snow-white. He didn't chase prairie dogs anymore. He just liked to lie where Eli's boots were. Nora was sitting on the porch steps. She had a thick book open on her lap. Inside the house, they could hear the clatter of plates. Maggie was frying chicken. The smell drifting out the screen door was enough to make a dead man hungry. Nora closed her book. She let it rest on her knees. She looked out at the rolling pasture. The wind blew gently, rustling the tall grass. "Mr. Calloway," Nora said. "Yeah, Nora." She didn't turn around right away. She kept watching the horizon. "Do you know when this place really became my home?" she asked. Eli stopped rocking. The chair settled flat. He looked at the back of her head. "When was it?" he asked. "It was the night you sat outside my door in the hallway," Nora said softly. "You didn't come in. You didn't tell me to stop crying. You just sat there, so I would know someone was standing guard." Eli didn't say anything. The memory of that night was still sharp. "I know it," Nora continued, turning to look at him now. Her eyes were bright in the fading light. "Because before that night, I used to lie awake. I would listen to the wind. I would listen to the floorboards, just trying to figure out if anyone was there. But after that night, I never had to listen again. I just knew." A long silence stretched between them. It wasn't heavy. It was completely full. Nora shifted on the wooden step. She looked at him with that same piercing honesty she had carried since she was 7. "Mr. Calloway," she said, her voice dropping a little, "do you know that you saved me?" Eli looked at her. He felt a tightness in his throat, but it wasn't a bad kind of tight. It was the feeling of a heart that was beating strong and true. "You saved me first, Nora," Eli said. His voice was rough, genuine. "You walked out of that brush on a Tuesday morning. I didn't have a single reason to wake up the next day. I was just waiting to die. You gave me a reason to open my eyes." Nora studied his face. She saw the absolute truth in it. She looked back out at the glowing horizon. She took a deep breath of the sweet spring air. "Then I suppose we ended up rescuing each other," Nora said. She turned back to him. She sat up very straight, the way she always did when she was about to say something important. Something her father would have wanted her to understand. "I thought about what happened to my papa. And I thought about what happened to your family," Nora said clearly. Her voice rang out on the quiet porch. "Mr. Calloway, I realize now that the love between people is the only real magic there is in this world. We are completely equal in our pain. It doesn't matter if you're a marshal or a little girl. And because we are equal in that pain, we are equally entitled to the right to be loved again. Nobody should ever have to lock their door and sit in the dark." Eli sat perfectly still. He let the words wash over him. They were simple. They were profound. And they were exactly right. Equally entitled to the right to be loved again. He looked at the little girl who had walked out of a nightmare and into his life. He looked at the ranch he had rebuilt with his own 2 hands. "You're right, Nora," Eli said softly. "You're exactly right." The screen door pushed open. Maggie stepped out. She was wiping her hands on a flour sack towel. She looked at Eli. She looked at Nora. She saw the look on their faces. She didn't ask what they were talking about. She just knew it was something good. "Dinner is on the table," Maggie announced. "And if you two sit out here philosophizing until my biscuits get cold, I'm feeding them to the dog." Deputy thumped his tail against the floorboards at the word dog. Eli smiled. He patted the dog's head. He stood up. "Come on," Eli said. "Let's go eat." Nora grabbed her book. She bounded up the steps and held the screen door open for him. That night, after the house was quiet and the lamps were turned down low, Eli walked out to the back porch. He stood alone in the dark. He looked up at the Texas sky. It was a sea of crushed diamonds. millions of stars staring back down at the dark earth. He took a deep breath. He thought about Clara. He thought about Thomas. He didn't push the memories away. He didn't lock them in a dark room. He invited them in. He imagined Clara standing next to him on the porch. He imagined her looking out at the straight fence lines, looking at the healthy cattle. You'd love her, Clara, Eli thought. She talks too much sometimes. She reads books I can't understand. But she's got a heart like a lion. You'd be proud of her. He imagined Thomas, 10 years old now, running through the tall grass, chasing the dog. A gentle breeze swept across the porch. It felt like a soft hand on his shoulder. He didn't feel the crushing weight of grief anymore. The prairie fire had finally burned itself out. The heavy stone in his chest had crumbled into dirt. And from that dirt, something green and strong had grown. The past and the present existed together, right here, in his heart. One didn't erase the other. His love for Clara and Thomas was eternal. And his love for the little girl sleeping down the hall was just as real, just as fierce. They shared the same space, and there was plenty of room. Eli closed his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered to the night sky. He didn't know who he was thanking. God, the universe, Daniel Hayes, or just the blind, beautiful luck of a Tuesday morning. He turned around. He went back inside. He didn't lock his bedroom door. The next morning, the sun wasn't quite up yet. The kitchen was washed in gray light. Eli stood by the wood stove. The coffee was brewing. The smell filled the small room. He held a heavy ceramic mug. He stood perfectly still. His broad shoulders were relaxed. His hands were steady. He looked at the doorway leading to the hall. He just waited. It was the routine, the quiet, beautiful routine of a life that mattered. He heard the soft sound of bare feet on the pine floorboards. A moment later, Nora appeared in the doorway. Her hair was a messy tangle. Her eyes were still heavy with sleep. She wore a long white nightgown. She rubbed her eyes with the back of her hand. She stopped in the doorway. She looked up. She saw Eli standing there, standing guard, standing right where he was supposed to be. She didn't look surprised. She didn't look relieved. She just looked like a child who knew exactly where she belonged. "Morning, Mr. Calloway," Nora mumbled, her voice thick with sleep. "Morning, Nora," Eli said softly. She walked past him, heading for the cupboard to grab a plate. "Maggie making pancakes today?" Nora asked, pulling a stool up to the counter. "She said she was," Eli replied, taking a sip of his coffee. "If you don't eat them all, I might get a few." Nora smiled. She rested her chin on her hands. "We'll see," she said. It was a perfectly normal morning, completely unremarkable, ordinary in every single way. And Eli knew right then and there that it was the greatest miracle he would ever witness. Decades later, folks in Harlan Creek still told the story. They didn't tell it like a tall tale. They didn't talk about gunfights at high noon, or outlaws riding into the sunset. They told it like a true story, because it was. They told the story of Eli Calloway, a man who had built a wall so thick and so high around his heart that nobody thought it would ever come down. A man who had decided that his life was over, and all that was left was the waiting. And they told the story of a 7-year-old girl. A girl who walked 11 miles on bleeding feet, carrying nothing but a leather notebook and a stubborn belief in the right to be heard. She walked up to that wall, and she knocked. That was the whole story, really. Because the bravest thing a man can do in this world isn't drawing a gun. It isn't riding into danger. It isn't dying for a cause. The bravest thing a man can do, after he has lost absolutely everything, after he has learned how to survive without anyone, after he has built a fortress to make sure he never hurts again, is to look at the person standing on the other side of the door and open it, to look them in the eye and say, "Not today. Today, you stay," and then to keep them. Every single day, one ordinary, beautiful day at a time. That's how you beat the dark. That's how you save a life. That's how the cowboy finally came home. The narrative presented here is fictional and created for artistic expression. Names, characters, and incidents are either invented or used in a fictitious manner. Any resemblance to actual persons or events is unintended and should not be considered factual or deliberate.
And so, under the wide and unforgiving Texas sky, the dust finally settled, not just on the roads of Harlan Creek, but in the hearts of those who had long forgotten what it meant to stand for something greater than themselves. Eli Calloway did not ride off into the sunset as a legend carved in gunfire and vengeance. Instead, he stayed. He chose the harder road, the one that demanded patience, courage, and the willingness to live with pain rather than be consumed by it. What makes this story linger is not the fall of a powerful man, nor the triumph of law over corruption. It is the quiet, profound transformation of a broken soul who believed he had nothing left to give. Through Nora, a child who had every reason to be afraid, yet chose to speak, to stand, and to believe in what was right, Eli remembered something he had buried deep within himself: that human dignity is not granted by power, wealth, or age, but is something each person is born with, and must protect in others as fiercely as in themselves. This story reminds us that justice is not always loud. It does not always come from the barrel of a gun or the speed of revenge. Sometimes justice is slow. It requires standing in the open when it would be easier to hide, speaking the truth when silence feels safer, and choosing compassion when hatred feels justified. Eli could have chosen the quick path, the path of anger and blood, but it was Nora's unwavering belief in what is right that led him towards something far more powerful: redemption. There is also a deeper truth here about responsibility. Not the kind that ends in sacrifice and martyrdom, but the kind that demands we stay, that we endure, that we wake up the next morning and continue to care, even when it terrifies us. Because living for others, protecting them, guiding them, and standing beside them is far more difficult than dying for them. And yet, it is in that choice to remain, to nurture, and to build again that true strength is found. Perhaps the greatest lesson this story offers is this: no matter how broken a person may feel, no matter how far they believe they have fallen into darkness, it only takes one moment, one person, one act of courage, one choice to step back into the light. And when one person stands, others will follow. A town that once bowed to fear found its voice again, not because of power, but because of unity, truth, and the courage of a little girl who refused to be silent. In the end, the West was never just about survival. It was about character, about the choices a person makes when no one is watching, and the legacy they leave behind when the dust settles. Eli Calloway did not just save Nora, he rebuilt a life, a home, and a future where hope could grow again. And maybe, just maybe, that's what matters most.